Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the webinar hosted by UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation and University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources Extension. Thank you for joining us during a lunch hour. We're here to talk about our new report and data source on the 663 community water systems in 6-county region, including LA. My name is Greg Pierce, Senior Director at the Luskin Center for Innovation. I'm going to kick us off, and then we're quickly going to get into, you can go to the next slide, quickly going to get into the results of the research that we have done. And I'll be joined there by Edith Guzman, who's the lead researcher on this work. Then we'll show you, namely Lauren Dunlap, will show you how you can access the data yourself and look well beyond the results that we're sharing here with you and in the report. And you can download the data and do more analysis, etc. And then we'll broaden the discussion even more with some of our colleagues and collaborators outside the walls of the university, Max Gomberg, Michael Rincon, Itzel Vasquez-Rodriguez. And then we'll hopefully have a good amount of time for Q&A and discussion with you all on this work, as it's intended really as a public resource, first and foremost. Just a tiny bit about the Luskin Center for Innovation. We're in the school, the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA, really an applied research center that works across the 6 areas and more that you see here, but with really strong focus areas, of course, on water, both water supply, water transition, water equity, but also on local climate action, on energy and transportation transition, on heat equity, urban greening, plastics, and more. But we really work in an engaged fashion with civic leaders, agencies, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations on environmental policy and especially equity questions in these domains. And then, as I just said, our work is focused on actionable research. And we, of course, we're scholars, but we work with a lot of students here. And we really are responsive to challenges that both we see, but our partners out in the world see to address or advance effective and equitable solutions to all the challenges that we have. Next slide. And our work on water is not just represented in the Atlas work that you'll see here. We work across the 4 areas you see on the screen, including local water transition, tap water trust, and more broadly, sort of water quality and health with respect to the big federal standards that we have for all water systems, as well as sanitation access. But we're here today to discuss the 2025 Southern California Water Access Atlas and data resource because this is in some ways the 3rd time we've done this. We actually really kicked off our water equity work at the center with a 2015 atlas that just looked at the 218 community water systems in Los Angeles. We re-upped that in 2020, and now we're here in 2025 having done this similar work and analysis for, as I mentioned at the outset, 663 individual community water systems across 6 counties. And we're focused on community water systems or water supply systems because, as you'll hear, they're really at the front lines of providing water to you and me, to homes, to businesses, to schools, to parks, you name it. These are really the end of the line water providers to users and are the ones who ensure or make or break on providing safe, clean, reliable water to all, to addressing and working to address climate change and to provide things like water for fire flow. Basically, these are the systems that provide the water to end users in residential and business areas. So with that, I want to turn it over to Edith to really get us going on the results and what our landscape looks like for community water systems in Southern California.
Thank you, Greg, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, we're now going to walk you through some of the main findings of the research, starting with general information about the water systems that we studied. Next slide, please. And here you can see how many systems each of the 6 counties that were part of this iteration of the research has, and what the average population served by each system is, with the key takeaway being that counties such as Kern and Ventura have systems that serve relatively fewer people than counties such as LA or Orange. So already just within these 6 counties, there's quite a lot of variability in that. Next slide. In this chart, you can see that really over 90% of residents in each county are served by either large or very large water systems, which essentially means that most customers are likely to be served by systems that have higher capacity across a number of performance measures that you'll hear about. However, there is a highly fragmented number of small systems that serve populations in each of the counties. So while most of the population is served by these large systems, that's not true everywhere, including most notably in Kern, Ventura, and San Bernardino. Next slide. In addition to the size of a water system, the governance type of water systems determines regulating authority and often influences the performance of a system. So each type of community water system is regulated by a different body of state law. And our analysis showed that the distribution of system types too is highly diverse, with no single type consistently in the majority across the counties. County level water systems are only present in 3 of the counties, which are LA, San Bernardino, and Ventura, while the other 6 water system governance types are present in all counties. Mutual water systems, in contrast, are the most common. In LA, with about 26%, they're closely followed by city-run systems and investor-owned utilities. So lots of variability there. And now I'll hand it back over to Greg to walk us through some of the water quality findings.
Thanks, Edith. So yeah, I'll give you a quick overview of the highlights of our water quality findings, with the caveat that I'm going to focus here on maximum contaminant level or primary health-related violations of water quality standards, but we recognize that those violations alone don't tell you the whole picture. We do more analysis, particularly around emerging contaminants in the report, and there's also other factors that are important. That being said, the lowest sort of hanging fruit and the primary standards to which community water systems are held really across the nation via the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is federal, are these MCL contaminant level standards. I would think there's 94 primary standards at last count. And every system, whether you're a mobile home park serving 25 people to Los Angeles Department of Water and Power in the region, which serves 4 million people, are held to largely the same standards. And what we see is that there are probably the greatest disparities across the county and sort of human right to water outcomes in the quality space, with Kern County systems having a lot of violations of primary standards. And on the other end of the spectrum, Orange County systems performing consistently well and much better than any of the other counties, even on a per capita basis. LA is kind of in the middle, and we do have more data going back a few years or 10 years on LA. We are able to see that in LA, there are actually slight decreases in maximum contaminant level violations, although they aren't, super substantial. Next slide. This is just a way of visualizing what I just said over the last 10 years. but really shows you the outlier, especially of Kern County in terms of total violations. You know, the relative, and that's the dark green bar, versus the light green bar is showing you the number of systems out of the total count that have a MCO violation or more in the last 10 years. Again, you can see Orange County is barely on the map, and Ventura is also has quite low levels of violations. Next slide. And then this is just a different, you know, slice the data looking at the last 5 years. I know there's a lot of numbers on the slide, but I would point you to, there's a slightly different story if you focus on the number of violations only among the systems that have a single violation, where San Bernardino actually is, you know, has the highest number. Kern comes in second, and then LA and San Bernardino aren't far behind. And that's quite a contrast from what we see in particularly Orange, but also Ventura counties. Next slide. And again, there's a lot more to say about quality, but you can look at that in the report and look at our other reports and talk to us if you want to hear more. I'll turn it back to Edith to talk about affordability.
Yeah, so thanks. So let's look briefly at affordability. We found that rate structures impact affordability, and most systems use what's called a fixed plus tiered structure, which charges customers a flat fee to cover basic service costs plus an additional charge based on water usage, with the price of that unit increasing in steps, right? As usage increases, there's a good chance that you all are under that system, that type of rate structure. Well, it turns out that type of rate structure tends to have higher monthly bills compared to other structures. We also found that water bills have been rising faster than inflation. Inflation has been about 3.8% annually in the last 10 years or so. But the water bill trajectory has looked more like 4.7% annually. And another finding is that disadvantaged communities actually often pay higher rates, which we will explore in the next slide. And then finally, a kind of additional takeaway around affordability is that, particularly given the prevalence of concerns around firefighting in the wake of January's fires, as it pertains to the firefighting capacity of water systems, we looked at how systems charge for fire suppression services and found no real consistencies. And that a lack of standardization around that really poses a barrier to improving resilience as wildfire risk increases, and something that we will be looking more at. Next slide, please. This figure underlines the concern that disadvantaged communities are many across Southern California's water systems landscape, and in some cases they actually pay more. A more equitable approach would be to see disadvantaged and severely disadvantaged communities paying lower water bills than their non-disadvantaged counterparts, but that's not always the case. Most notably, you can see that in Kern, the average monthly bill for severely disadvantaged communities actually far exceeds that for better resourced communities. And we also found evidence of this, though to a lesser extent, in Orange and San Bernardino. Next slide. Zooming into LA and the trends over the last 10 years, we see that there's a steady and substantial increase in average monthly bills. The average rate rose from about $50 in 2015 to $63 in 2020, and then almost $80 in 2025, which is 59% increase over 10 years. And although the minimum rate remained relatively stable between 2020 and 25, the maximum rate actually jumped pretty dramatically from $134 to $231. And this, for many of us, that might not be very significant, but this actually indicates widening disparities in what customers are paying across different water systems and points to water affordability becoming an escalating challenge. And now Greg will walk us through a few headlines related to accessibility.
Yeah, so I'll be brief here because we're briefest in the section. The report, in some ways, accessibility is hardest to define, certainly around the human right to water outcomes systems are aspiring to and held to. I also encourage you to really look both at our recent student report on this topic for small water systems in the county and the broader SB 552 process that the county is involved in with Department of Water Resources. That being said, in terms of our findings here, we look both at just overall usage of water or consumption levels, as well as around drought resilience planning. We can't get at actually measuring what people consume on a household level and sort of minimum standards. We do see generally that water usage is fairly consistent in winter months, but varies quite a bit more across the region in summer, ranging from 87 gallons per capita per day in LA to 134 in Riverside. We do see modest continued conservation over and above, fairly major conservation that's taken place in the region, certainly over the last 25 years. But I'll note that these, GPCD, if you like that acronym, standards are still well above, the conservation as a way of life standards that the state has on the books, that are around 55 gallons, going toward 42 gallons for indoor use in the state over the coming decades. And then the next slide, I think, is our final slide of results. Say with the caveat on the last slide that drought preparedness and planning alone is not the full story. That we were able to analyze some data on drought planning and preparedness, and really see higher numbers than higher percentages. Well, higher numbers in LA County and higher percentages in Ventura County, both of systems with projected shortages and systems with declared water shortages. But note that there's also quite a bit of variation in the percent of systems that even file a plan or report on this information. So that may be skewing the analysis in some ways, particularly in LA County. Again, in Orange County, you see high levels of reporting, whereas some counties, you don't see a lot of systems reporting, in particular Kern County, which certainly has its water shortage and accessibility challenges. But with that, that's a high-level overview of the report. Obviously, y'all can read the report, but I want to turn over to Lauren, who helped create a tool so that you can do a much deeper dive and look at anything and everything that we analyzed on your own. So Lauren, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Greg. Okay, so let me just get us, oops, sorry. That's not what I wanted. Okay, let me just get us over to our website to show you how to use the tool. So you can access the mapping tool directly on our center's website using this embedded version, or you also can open it in a new tab for optimal viewing. So this is what it'll look like if you access it. You can see that the tool presents data on the water systems, both at the system level and at the county level. So each of the two options, which you can find at the top of the screen up here, present the data just in a slightly different format and slightly different data. And so starting out with the data by water system, you can see that the data is organized into these 4 categories: quality, affordability, reliability or accessibility, and then governance. And within each of the categories, there are a few different maps. So to give the example, using the quality by system, you can see there are 4 different maps here with different water quality data. So, showing first the MCL violations in the past 5 years and then the past 10, et cetera. And so then if you, within each map, want to explore a bit further, you can obviously zoom in and look around, and you can click on the different systems to get some basic information like the number and county and governance type and the name of the system, of course. And then you can see the data based on the legend, and that's pretty much it. It's simple. And then you can click over to other maps, and also you can see the county outlines as well, just to help clarify that. And then if you click over to the data by county, you can see similarly that there are 5 different categories here. Each of the categories has 2 to 4 maps. And then, similarly, it's a little overview with the income and population data, quality with the same data as in the data by system, affordability with the average monthly bills, which includes 2 different amounts of water use, and then reliability and finances by county. So the one thing that's a little different for the county view is that you can see a few charts as well to compare across the counties. So for example, in the quality section, if you click this little blue chart button in the legend, it'll open up a chart that allows for easy comparison across the counties and across the quality indicators. So that pretty much wraps up the tool demo. It's really a simple mapping tool. And I think I can pass it back over to our speakers.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. I do want to say before that, again, we designed this as a public resource. And the state has, various state agencies have versions of much of this data themselves, and you should check those out as well. But we package this together to come up with sort of a set of things that we know folks are interested in, and to make the data a little more accessible, and I think in some cases a little more accurate, because we don't have to look at 2,800 systems versus 600 systems. But also, unlike much of our other work, we're not aiming this directly to inform or make recommendations on specific policies or certainly pieces of legislation. That being said, there's a lot of relevance, and to talk about the relevance of this work and this tool, and really what work needs to be done in this broader space, we have a great panel of 3 folks. First, as you can see on the screen, Max Gomberg, who's an independent consultant on water affordability and resilience, and also a board member, an advisory board member of the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. Next, we have Michael Rincon, who's the research and policy manager for the organization Physicians for Social Responsibility in Los Angeles. Last but not least, we have Itzel Vasquez-Rodriguez, who's the project manager for Rural Community Assistance Corporation, or you may know them as RCAC. Coincidentally or not, all 3 of these folks are graduates of the UCLA programs in the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Also, I want to note that Michael and Itzel are co-authors on this report and have many things to say, working in super relevant spaces for and in conversation with community water systems across the state. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Edith to facilitate a discussion and reaction from our panel.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks to all of our panelists for joining us, and virtual high fives to Itzel and Michael for getting us to this point, because you all did a lot of work. This is a project that took nearly 18 months to bring to fruition, because it takes a lot to go through, collect the data, analyze the data, and It's painstaking work, so thank you both for all of that. So we have a little bit of time to really dig into what this tells us and where we go from here. So I wanted to kick us off by asking each of you to reflect on what a surprising takeaway from the research is for you. And put another way, is there a trend that concerns you, or perhaps a trend that you're pleased to see? And Itzel, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you all so much, first of all, for having me. It's really great to see the transition and transformation of this work. As Edith mentioned, myself and Vivian Cruz, along with other co-authors, were some of the early pioneers, I guess, on this project. And so seeing just the transformation from the point where we started to where the research is now, it's really great to see. But to answer your question, Edith, a sort of surprising takeaway from the report for me in particular, and this wasn't necessarily called out in the report, but it was highlighted in the like rate sheet affordability section, and then you all also kind of covered it just now. But I was really surprised to learn how difficult rate sheets are to obtain and to understand. So even as someone who has worked in this water world for, oh gosh, like 10 plus years now, I couldn't read half the rate sheets. Yeah, it was really rough. And so Vivian and I were in charge of trying to collect some of these rate sheets, and some rate sheets were included on websites. Some rate sheets were available as PDFs. Some rate sheets we had to call systems directly to try and collect them. And so it was really difficult, surprisingly so, I think overall, just to try and compile this information and then be able to understand it in a way where rates can be compared across different systems. Because as you all mentioned, there are rate sheets that have different structures, or I'm sorry, systems that have different rate structures. There are different fees, different names of fees, there's different formatting, there's different billing cycles, different units that are used that make it incredibly complicated to compare this data across systems and to understand the affordability aspect really for a lot of different systems. So that for me was a takeaway, not necessarily one of the biggest ones of the report, but a surprising takeaway for me as someone who started this work pretty early on.
Yeah, thank you. And it's one of the reasons why this took so long, right? Because it is really painstaking work. Michael, what about you? What's the surprising takeaway that you found, especially given that you did spend months on this project with us?
Yeah, well, I also want to know, both, give flowers to Itzel, Vivian, and Jennifer, who are also part of the team. I kind of came in at the end of the project, mostly helping with some of the analysis of the data. So yeah, so thank you to everyone who contributed to the project and those before us. I would say that where I wasn't too surprised was the affordability sections. I think we've known for a while that the price of water was increasing. But I do think that what was interesting, through this project process was second, I'm uplifting too, like Itzel's points around how difficult it was to analyze the rate sheets themselves. And then at times too, like we also realized, oh, like some of them were like out of date from when they were initially collected, because maybe a new one got uploaded, or they just weren't regularly like the websites weren't like regularly kept up to date too, was another thing that we kind of noticed. And so it was just really hard to get a lot of this info. And then the other piece around the rate sheets too was that there was a screenshot in the report, which I believe I was the one who took it, but it was around how the different tiers are established when it comes to charging your water, and it required certain data that wasn't like universally used or accepted. More so it's just like you needed like evapotranspiration data, you needed I believe it's like elevation, like are you at a higher elevation or a lower elevation, that also affects the price of water. And so all that was really, really interesting for me and shocking. But I also now understand it a little bit more. So overall, in terms of affordability, like, yeah, like I'm not too shocked about it, but And it is concerning, and it's probably going to be one of those issue areas that we in particular as a public health organization are going to focus on as well, addressing the affordability aspect, because people don't have access to water, or can't afford their water, then it becomes a public health issue as well. But where I will say I was, pleasantly surprised too was around how water quality violations have decreased overall. But I think it does, kind of go back to like, what's really the drivers of those water quality violation improvements? Like, is it technology? Is it like, from like my experience, like I work a lot on PFAS issues in the city of California. And so I've known that there's been PFAS bans in a lot of different products, which are this, a lot of these manufacturing facilities are in LA. So that was my, interpretation of the data itself. But until we really figure out what's driving those MCL, or at least water quality improvements, we can't really say, it's great, or that, things are going, well, I mean, things are going the right way, but I mean, just really need knowing what's driving the water quality improvements is a big question that I would like to investigate further. So yeah, but that's me.
Great. Thanks for that. Great points. And Max, what about you? What was surprising for you in what you saw?
Well, I also want to just appreciate and commend all the great work that's gone into this report, and seeing its now in its third iteration. It's just a really great wealth of information, and an ability to see trends over time, which is so important for policymakers. So, like Michael and Itzel, I sort of want to reflect on the affordability findings. And in particular, what was striking to me was the table 11, which is at the top of page 32, which compares the cost increases over the past 5 years for different system types. And it basically, on average, shows that the serve higher communities and greater percent increases, which in a way is sort of it's nice to see that, to see that, right, that there are adjustments being made to reflect all of the cost drivers for, broadly speaking, communities that can afford to shoulder those extra costs. On the other hand, it raises some questions about, are the smaller percentage increases for the disadvantaged communities a reflection of the managers of those systems not wanting to burden affordability further, but maybe not being able to make necessary investments? What's not happening there? And then just this broader question about, we know that rates have been rising faster than inflation for quite some time, decades at this point, creating even more affordability difficulties for greater numbers of people, whether they're served by a small system in a disadvantaged community or whether they're economically struggling even as part of a larger system. And so it really, I think, continues to shine a light on the fact that there's so much more work to do in the affordability space, and we have to be able to overcome some of the challenges that have been around and have been documented by UCLA and others when it comes to programs to really address affordability.
Thank you for that. And that's a good segue to discussing how we can use the data, right? So in thinking about the work that you do, that each of you do, and how you intersect with water management and governance, how is this information useful to you or to the arena that you kind of work in? Mikey, let's start with you. And then let's go to Max and then Itzel.
Sure. I think for us in particular, I mean, again, like PSRLA it's a public health organization, and we work on a number of different issues. And for me in particular, the way that I would like to use this data and how I also plan to use this data is that we also work in the realm now of addressing affordability in terms of making sure that that, for example, like if a low-income rate assistance program is developed, that renters often have access to those type of programs. Or on top of that, that affordability and what you're actually paying for water is transparent for the renters. I mean, for the communities that we work with here in LA, like a majority, more specifically, we work a lot in the Southeast LA region, which a majority of that area are predominantly renters, of the population. And so a lot of those renters often don't have access to their water bill because the water bill is often embedded, or what they pay for water is often embedded with the rent. So people don't actually know what they're paying and how much of the rent payment actually goes to the water. And so there's a transparency issue there, and there's an accessibility issue there because of if there are affordability, programs for low-income Californians, which majority of low-income Californians actually also happen to be renters. I mean, there's just a gap there. And so for us in particular, we're trying to figure out how to address that issue, and just kind of help people get more information and understand, what is their rights as tenants as well. And then on, again, the water quality side of things, I mean, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but I mean, for us, we work on a number of different environmental justice issues, everything from safer consumer products to oil drilling, the decarbonization of our energy grid, water, land use decisions, and you name it. And in all of those different issue areas, there's contaminants, or the way that contaminants get into the environment is very, very different. And but I will always say that everything always ends up in the water. And on top of that, I think Greg mentioned that there's about 100, MCLs, but there's over 10,000 different chemicals on the US market. So those 100 MCLs don't actually show the entire picture. So for us, I mean, this helps us show that, there is a trend that water quality is getting better, but that leads me again to uplift my question again of like, what is the driver of that water quality improvements? If it's the chemical bans, for example, like with PFAS, then we're going to continue to make strides in that realm, and how do we also make sure that industry, is being held accountable, because it's often the water customers that are paying to clean up a mess that they didn't create. So how do we hold industry accountable so that they can contribute to addressing these water quality issues as well? Maybe for us in particular, we thought of the idea of an EPR policy, extended producer responsibility, so that money can actually be, funneled into addressing water quality issues across the state. So that's something that we're interested in exploring.
Right. Yeah, those are great points. And one of the themes here for us, I think every time we answer questions, we have more questions that come up about, well, why is that trend appearing to be that way? And what's sort of the causal mechanism, if we can find it. Max, what about you? How is this information useful to you or those you work with?
It's very useful to all of the organizations I work with. I work with tribes and advocacy organizations on policy for water equity, both at the state level and federally. And I think there are a number of conclusions drawn from this report and the data itself that are useful to inform a number of discussions at the state level around funding, around regulatory policy, and around sort of overall data collection practices, to really have a full ongoing picture of what's going on in the drinking water space. And I'll just note also, it's a good reminder of what's left to be done to really get much further down the road towards the state's human right to water goals of safe, accessible, and affordable water for everyone. There is more to do. It does require more resources. And at the same time, when we're in an era where tremendous amount of resources are being dedicated at the federal level, weaponized against communities, it's a reminder that if we made different choices as a society, we could really solve a lot of problems, including adequate funding and affordability for our water systems.
Thanks, Max. Great points. And we will talk about the impacts around the human right to water in just a few minutes here. But Itzel, what about you? How are you thinking about using these findings?
Oh, no, and thanks for the questions and Michael and Max for your answers. It's spurring a lot more questions and answers in my mind too. But I guess just by way of background for the audience here. So as Greg mentioned earlier, I'm a project manager for RCAC, the Rural Community Assistance Corporation. And we are a nonprofit technical assistance provider that works throughout the Western United States, and including California. In fact, most of our staff are based in California, and we focus on supporting rural and indigenous communities. And so we're oftentimes brought in to sort of move projects along, or once a problem is identified, sort of we're brought in to try and sort of guide a project through all of the bureaucracy, either at the federal level or the state level, to get that project to completion. And so just, I guess, 2 points I wanted to bring up here. The first of which kind of piggybacks on Max's and Michael's comments earlier regarding water bills and water affordability for people. So at RCAC, I think one of the programs or projects that have really grown within our organization over the past couple of years are rate studies. So we conduct rate studies for small water systems. And more oftentimes than not, we find that water systems were not charging enough for water. Their systems have often been chronically underinvested in. And so maybe they put in new pipes 100 years ago and now they need to upgrade those pipes, but they haven't been putting money aside to be able to do that. And so rates now need to increase pretty dramatically to be able to cover these kinds of necessary upgrades to keep the water clean and safe to drink. And so that's just one piece of how we're seeing some of this work on the ground and how this information would be useful for us. I think it points to a trend that we were seeing and could provide some answers as to why, in part, some of these rates are going up, right? There's deferred maintenance maybe, or systems were just not invested in for a while, or water systems weren't charging what they should have been for many years, and now those rates need to jump. And so I think that's a really interesting finding that we could help validate or, sort of look at throughout the state as well. And then the other point that I wanted to bring up here in terms of how this information in the report is useful to organizations like RCAC, I think for us, it really points to the need to support rural and indigenous communities who are oftentimes served by small water systems. And so small water systems were pointed out in this report as some of those with more violations, or more common violations. Kern County in particular has a lot of small water systems. And in our line of work, we see that small water systems are oftentimes, trying to do their best, and they lack the economies of scale, the resources, the operations and maintenance funding, as well as other items to be able to make necessary upgrades and to be able to provide safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. And so I think this report really just points to that trend and that need to support our rural and indigenous communities who are, again, oftentimes serviced by small water systems.
Go ahead, Mikey.
Yeah, and I really want to, I want to build off of what Itzel was talking about there, because one of the things that is really interesting and hard about working in water is that we work with a lot of community-based organizations who often don't necessarily have a dedicated water staff member. And that's for like a number of reasons why. But because of also the fact that water itself as a policy issue has a very high learning curve, especially with all the jargon and the technical details and understanding, it's not as simple as one may think. This report and this tool, like it's a very digestible resource for a lot of people, and it's something that we also plan on sharing with folks and stuff. But it's really hard to find a good resource that explains these issues and explains how, for example, like the findings, what may be contributing to them, like what does this mean, all in a single place. Often that's not available. And so the report and the map is a really useful tool for people who want to be water policy advocates, which is something we focus on trying to build the capacity of local leaders to advocate on their own water issues as well. So
These are all great points, and thank you for explaining how you're viewing use of the data now that we have 3 iterations of it. So I know we have a number of questions, but I do have from the audience, that is, so we're going to get to those momentarily, but I do have one more question for our panelists, and that's really looking at how are we doing in Southern California with respect to the human right to water. And for those of you who don't know in the audience, the human right to water, in 2012, Jerry Brown signed AB 685, which essentially affirmed California's commitment to that concept that every individual in the state should have a right and has a right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. So maybe taking 1 minute each from each of you. Let's go Itzel, Mikey, and then Max. Are there specific areas that we should be focused on? Maybe one specific area related to the human right to water that we're currently not focused on that we should be drawing more attention toward.
In 1 minute, let me try. I think maybe one instance that kind of comes to mind, and I think dovetails with a lot of the conversation that we've had today, is the need for rate assistance programs for folks throughout the state. So we have rate assistance programs for energy and for many other, utilities that we use, but we don't have one for water. And so it's a huge burden for folks to be able to afford their water rates. I think especially considering the conversation that we've had today with small water systems who are just trying to get by. And if they need, a new pump or some kind of new generator, they have to pass that cost along to their customers. That's really the only choice that they have. And those customers oftentimes or many times are low income folks. And so that is an incredible burden. So I'm looking into rate assistance programs, I think, to really get at the affordability, accessibility piece of the human right to water is one that I would highlight.
Thank you. Michael, what about you?
I second that what Itzel mentioned, but I think for us in particular, it's the water quality and the water trust aspect of it. I mean, we can make water affordable, but if you don't address the history around environmental racism when it comes to water, and you don't connect the water purveyors with the community-based organizations or improve engagement, then it's going to be really hard to convince people that it's okay and it's safe now to use their water, even if it is cheaper. The issues that we deal with, or the stories that we keep hearing in LA, is that people won't use their water aside from just bathing and maybe cooking, but for the most part, they would rather pay more if it means that they feel a sense of safety or just of security. So that's an area that should be really uplifted.
Thank you. And Max, you get the last word on this particular question.
Well, I agree with what Itzel and Mikey said. I think that the thing I would add is the vulnerability for the small systems. We didn't talk about it too much here, right? But we saw the devastating impact of the fires, particularly on the smallest systems. And it really, and looking at that, and looking at the ongoing water quality issues in Kern County in particular, but also in Riverside, it really speaks to these critical policy questions of what are we doing as a society, as a sort of state government in particular, but to reduce those vulnerabilities. And if we're not being proactive about it, what is that? What are the consequences of that in terms of all of these metrics going forward? So that's I think another critical piece.
Well, again, appreciate the 3 of you joining us and sharing some really thoughtful insights and raising some really important questions for us all to think about. We now have a number of questions that have come in, so let me hand this over to Amaya to help to moderate and get some of these questions asked.
Yes, so for the Q&A portion, you can enter any questions you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar. If any resonate with you, you can upvote them. And then I think we'll take one live to start. So if anyone would like to ask their question live, you can raise your hand and then I'll unmute you.
I will say we also have a number of questions in the Q&A. I answered some of them, or I gave responses to some of them, but I can also pinpoint ones to ask. I see Charming.
Okay, there we go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question actually is to everyone, because when you mention rate assistance programs, we do have Prop 218 that actually prevents that from happening. Up to yesterday, I was speaking with Greg Reed from LEDWP, and he was speaking about the fact that they used to have it and they got sued, and so they had to discontinue it. So my question is to everyone here, how can we bypass Prop 218 to actually install rate assistance programs? Or do you think we have to always partner with, an NGO or CBO like PACE and donate money so that they can help offset people that are in arrest, keeping in mind that for PACE, you can only apply to offset arrests like once a year. So that may not necessarily help someone who's in a very tight situation, who's lost their job or has high medical bills, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to nominate Max to speak to this.
Okay, I'm going to try to give the really brief version because we could do a whole separate multi-hour webinar just on 218. Prop 218 is an issue. And from my perspective, working on water issues in California for 20 years, the best thing to do would be to reform it. That requires getting another initiative on the ballot, which means that 2/3 of our legislature would have to vote to put it on the ballot. I think it would be nice if our water systems and their associations would support that. I'll just leave that comment there. In addition, I think, particularly with regard to recent court cases and some of the findings in this report about the rate structures, it raises a host of additional questions about, are the water systems, for their own financial stability, putting too much of their revenue generation in fixed charges, which, as we know, are regressive. They harm low-income households the most. And are those rates even compliant with 218 when you start to think about what actually goes into cost of service and who's driving the need to expand water system facilities or develop new supplies? It's not residential customers who are efficient or don't use a lot of water. So there are a lot of questions there. But the last thing I'll say is, right, the legislature did ask the state to develop a set of recommendations for a low-income rate assistance program. We did that, and there have been several attempts now to create one, and none of them have been successful. So it's an area of ongoing need.
Thanks, Max. I think I'm going to go ahead and read out another question that Andrea had, which is, anyone can answer this. Can you expand a little more on how reporting water quality violations alone is insufficient? Are there recommendations on how regulations could change so there's more to do than just reporting? Maybe some more action-oriented regulations. So I'll go ahead and see who wants to respond to that. I do want to say there is a lot of reporting and testing that is done by systems that's required. Most systems do a great job with that and are serving very safe water, certainly much safer water than you can necessarily get bottled water or other types of sources that are much less regulated. But that being said, if people want to comment on going beyond violations, want to open the floor.
Well, I'll start by saying that the process for also establishing an MCL is it's a really long, complex process and often takes years. I mean, the PFAS specifically. So I keep coming back to PFAS, but PFAS is just really interesting because for those who are not familiar, PFAS is a family of synthetic, like man-made chemicals. There's a lot of them. But unfortunately, at this moment, there's only MCLs for 2 of them, which are the longer chain, like the more problematic ones. But then another thing that we often see is that when you start to regulate one particular contaminant, for example, one thing that ends up happening is it drives innovation, which is good, but there's also what I often refer to as like reckless innovation. And an example of that is with BPA. And BPA was like in water bottles, for example. And then when that got phased out, the industry basically the chemical industry replaced it with BPS, which is very similar to BPA. It's a shorter chain by like a couple molecules or a couple atoms, I believe, but they're still just as toxic. And so all the regulations that apply to BPA don't apply to BPS. And so that's another issue area that like we try to like advocate on around like how do we create safer alternatives as well. I mean, that's really the main point that I really want to make right now, just for time. But yeah, like the MCL process is it takes a long time, and it can often also be political at sometimes, which is very unfortunate. But trying to figure out how to create a rapid or a faster MCL establishment process without compromising the safety and the health protective aspects of it is really crucial. So trying to figure out how to do that, gonna take all of us and more to figure that out.
I see, Andrea, you've raised your hand. If you could make a really quick clarification, we can do that, but otherwise we're gonna run out of time.
Yes, sorry, super quick. I was referring to thank you for providing that as well. I saw a comment on the slide that, and I think on the report as well, that just referred to how some systems were like good at reporting some of these violations, but then we're still struggling. So I was curious about like the statement of how just reporting violations alone is insufficient, if that makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, I think really quickly beyond what Mikey said, I mean, there's different types of violations. We didn't even talk about monitoring and reporting violations, which are more about whether a system has provided transparent information about how it's doing. We focused on the health-related violations, but I think the point on the slide was more to a points we made earlier around you don't just want to look at whether a system exceeded the standard. You want to look at whether they're close to a standard, and you want to look at new standards, which Mikey has talked a good amount about here, that are going to come online for emerging contaminants or PFAS. So I think that's all we can say for now, but happy to follow up if you want to discuss more.
No, that's great. Thank you both. Yeah.
Okay, I also want to acknowledge a lot of people have mentioned the fires, and we continue to do a lot of work on the fires. We have a lot of reports, but continue to do a lot of work there. So if you want to talk about that or see those resources, let us know and we can connect you. But we are at time, so I want to turn it over to Edith to close us out, and thank you all.
Yeah, I wish we had more time to go through all of the questions, but we do appreciate everybody joining today and helping us have this very robust discussion about what do we know, what do we still not know, what do we need to do. We have plenty of resources on our website for you to dive into these topics, as well as a number of the other adjacent topics that have come up, including fire. So I do encourage you to please, get on our newsletter if you're not already on it. and take a look at the various activities that we're all sort of very actively working on. And stay tuned for future webinars, reports, and other products that we hope will help advance this discussion and bring policy and other solutions to this space. So again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful rest of your day.